These little birdies are the perfect plushies for market. They're super easy to make and it's so fun to customize each one. This makes it not so boring when you have to make a million of them for your market that's coming up this weekend. My little birdie pattern has detailed instructions, step-by-step photos, and a full list of colors to make 20 different types of birds. They're so much fun and easy for even a beginner to make, so I thought it'd be really cool to turn into a series on my YouTube channel where I'll show you how to make 2 birdies at a time until I get through all 20. And I'll probably come up with some new ones along the way too. They were one of my best sellers at my spring markets, and it was so uplifting to hear how excited people got when they found their favorite birds. I think they're the perfect size for an affordable plushie because they don't take me too long to make, but they're still super cuddly. I thought I'd start the series off by showing how to make 2 of my favorite birds, the pigeon and the seagull. Here are some of the supplies that I'll be using, but you should feel free to use any type of yarn you would like, or even scraps you have lying around, because it doesn't take much to make a birdie. Controversial take, but my yarn of choice is Bernat blanket, and hear me out. They switched manufacturers and some of the yarn is actually really soft now, but some of the colors still aren't super soft, so I'd definitely pick it out in person if you're not sure what you're gonna get. I'll be using 14mm safety eyes, polyfill stuffing, and a darning needle, as well as super sharp scissors. And if you're a beginner who's not super familiar with working in the front loop only and the back loop only, you might want 9 stitch markers. Another one of my crochet opinions that might not be too popular, but if you're having trouble crocheting, the problem might be your hook. I'll be using a 6.5mm inline crochet hook by Susan Bates. It's also called an open throat hook, and as you can see, compared to the closed throat hook, it's very different and really does make a difference when you're crocheting. It's super early in the morning and a beautiful day, so let's put on a CD and get started. Start with the color you'd like your bird's head to be. I'm gonna pick a white and make the seagull first. Make a magic circle, leaving a tail that's long enough to tie, and chain 1. This is just how I like to make them, and there are a bunch of different ways on the internet if you want to do it different. The chain 1 that we use to make the magic circle doesn't count, and we're going to pretend like it doesn't exist. For row 1, we'll be working 8 single crochets into the magic circle. If you're using a chenille type of yarn, you might want to work these single crochets loosely so that your yarn doesn't snap when you try and pull it tight. For row 2, we're going to completely ignore that starting chain we used to make the magic circle and work an increase into each stitch, starting with the first single crochet. This plushie pattern is worked in the round, so we're not going to chain 1 or slip stitch at the end of each row. It might be helpful to use a stitch marker to keep track of the row's progress as we go. I always place my stitch marker in the last stitch of each row, and that way I know when I've made it completely around, and so I can always double check if my stitch count is correct. Now that we've reached row 3, we're going to be working 1 single crochet into 1 stitch and an increase in the next. The increases should always line up with the increases from the row below, and the single crochet should always be between them. Now for the easiest part of this pattern, we're going to single crochet around for 4 rows. I thought I'd use this chance to mention the sponsor of the video today. Cool Guy the Bernat wanted to remind you that crocheting is all about having fun, and you shouldn't stress about it if you miss a stitch or like to do things differently. All that matters is that you're having a good time along the way and that you create something you can be proud of. Once you finish your 4 rows of single crochets, we'll move on to row 8, where I'll show you how to make your first color change. Any type of light gray would work great for a seagull's body. The easiest way to do a color change is to not finish your last stitch, and to use your new color to pull through and complete it. This way you'll have a fresh start with your new stitch, but because we are working in the round, you will always have a little bit of a skip on the back of your birdie. I like to crochet a few stitches just so I know that it's secure before I stop and tie all of the ends 3 times each. Finish single crocheting around this row, and then for row 9 we'll be doing 2 single crochets and then an increase in the next 8 times. This will be the last increase row, and then the next row I'll show you how to create the wings using the front loop only and back loop only of the stitches that we have. Let's start row 10 with 6 single crochets before we start to add the first wing. So this is the front loop and this is the back loop of a stitch. If you're a beginner or if you're just not used to working with fuzzy yarn, you can place 4 stitch markers in the back loop only of the next 4 stitches. This will help you in row 11. In the front loop only of the first marked stitch, we're going to make 1 slip stitch and then chain 3, slip stitch into the front loop only of the next marked stitch, chain 3, and slip stitch into the front loop only of the next marked stitch, chain 3, you guessed it, and then slip stitch into the front loop only of the last marked stitch, Oh my gosh, I already have a speech impediment and I can't say my S's. I had to record that like 8 times. Anyway, single crochet 11 and we'll get to the point where we get to add our next wing. And honestly, I might just copy and paste the audio over so I don't have to do that again. Place your stitch markers in the back loop only of the next 4 stitches, and then we'll make the second wing. In the front loop only of the first marked stitch, we're going to make 1 slip stitch. And then chain 3, slip stitch into the front loop only of the next marked stitch, chain 3, and slip stitch into the front loop only of the next marked stitch, chain 3, you guessed it, and then slip stitch into the front loop only of the last marked stitch. Now we're going to make 7 single crochets to finish the row. This technique is really easy, it just looks kind of weird when it's written on paper and overwhelming because there's a lot of abbreviations, but it's simple and kind of similar to my cat loaf pattern if you're familiar with that one. Yay, it's starting to look kind of similar to a bird and not just a blob. Now for row 11, it's also super simple. You just have to be careful and count your stitches so you don't add any extras. To start row 11, we're going to create 6 single crochets, which will bring us to this point. We want to be careful not to put a single crochet in this last area because it's actually the slip stitch that we're going to be working behind in the back loop only from row 10. Now we can take out these stitch markers and work 1 single crochet into each back loop for a total of 4 single crochets underneath the wing. It's a super easy technique, and like I said before, it's just weird to read on paper sometimes. After we finish those 4 single crochets, we are going to want to be careful. When we go to work back in the front, we don't want to put a single crochet in where the slip stitch is. We want to make it into the top of the first full single crochet. I think the little wings look so cute and dainty. They look like they would have to flap really hard to fly. Okay, now we're gonna make 11 single crochets to get to the next wing. But like I said earlier, just be careful and count for this part just so you don't make a single crochet in that last slip stitch, where we're going to want to flip it over and work underneath in the marked stitches. So take the stitch markers out and single crochet 4 in the back loop only, stitches that we had marked underneath the wing. Sorry to say it again, but when you flip to work into the front, just be careful you don't make a single crochet into that slip stitch, and you go right into the first real single crochet where you should make 7 to make it to the end of the row. Okay, now the hardest part of the pattern is behind us. For row 12, let's just single crochet around and hear a quick message from our sponsor. Don't neglect a project just because it might take a lot of time or might not ever sell. If you always focus on making money with crochet, you're not gonna love it. Now's a great time to add eyes to our plushie. Here's how I like to do it. I'm using 14mm safety eyes with simple washer backs. I insert them between rows 5 and 6 with 4 visible stitches between them. This part is important because later on when we add the beak, we want it to be centered, and this way there will be 2 stitches on either side of the beak, whether we do it horizontal or vertical. I like to add a dot of this Arlene's Fabric Fusion to the inside of the plushie before I attach the washers. It's super permanent though, like it's never gonna come out. So make sure your eyes are exactly where you want them before you put it on. Now for row 13, we're actually gonna single crochet 13 before we add the first foot. Each foot is a 3 double crochet bobble stitch. So here's how I like to do it. We're gonna complete the 13th stitch and then yarn over with our foot color and create 3 double crochets into the same stitch without finishing each one. And then once we finish, we're gonna drop the foot color and pick up the body color again to pull through all 4 loops on your hook to create the bobble stitch. We're going to single crochet 4 in between the feet and then repeat the process for the second foot. Yarn over with the foot color, insert your hook, and create 3 double crochets without finishing each one. Grab the foot color again, pull through all 4 loops on your hook, and then single crochet. Now is a great time to stop and tie your foot color ends before we continue so they don't get all tangled up in your work. Counting that first single crochet we made, we're going to make 11 total single crochets before we end the row. And we're ending this row early and it's a little shorter than it should be because now we're going to create the tail and we want it to be centered. You can add 4 stitch markers into the back loop only because this is the same technique as the wing. You slip stitch, chain 3, slip stitch, chain 3 for a total of 3 loops, and 4 stitches. The rest of the row is super easy, and we're just going to invisible decrease until we reach the tail. To make an invisible decrease, you want to pull up the front loop only for the next 2 stitches. Pull through those 2 loops on your hook, and then pull through again, and that completes 1 invisible decrease. Once we reach the tail, we want to flip it over to work behind in the back loop only stitches that we have marked. We're going to single crochet 4 times. When I first started working on this design, I had been making invisible decreases behind the tail, and it just made it like too hard to try and find the right loops to grab. So I switched it to single crochets, and I think it's a lot easier, and it doesn't change the way it looks at all. Now is a great time to stuff your plushie because we're gonna invisible decrease again for the next row to continue closing it. I like to pull the stitches tight after I make them so there are no holes, and I continue adding a little bit of stuffing to make sure it's even. Fasten off and then use your tail to sew the plushie closed. Tie your knot and thread off to the side before cutting the end. Yay, we finished crocheting the body of the birdie. Now let's add little details like his beak and blush. I'll even show you how to add a tiny bit of eye color to make the plushie come to life. I usually like to use cotton worsted weight yarn, like the name brand Sugar and Cream, to add plushie face details. For this pattern, I thought it'd be really fun to use the same Bernat blanket to add the beak, and I really like how it looks. As I mentioned when we were adding the eyes, there should be 4 visible stitches between them. I like to sew directly into the middle to add either a vertical beak or a horizontal beak. I think the vertical beak looks really good, and the horizontal one makes the plushies look super silly, so keep that in mind. I just thread over the 2 stitches as many times as I like, and then back to where I started so I can tie my knot and hide the ends with my crochet hook. A great rule to follow when you're sewing on details onto a plushie is to always start and end somewhere far away from where you're actually adding the details, and that way the knot and just pulling it into the plushie to hide it doesn't ever disturb what you're making. For the blush, I'm using cute little sparkle yarn, and I do the same technique where I go in from the side away from the detail I'm adding, loop over a stitch as many times as I'd like, and then pull through back to where I started, tie the knot, and hide it in the plushie using my crochet hook. I am going to be using a cotton worsted weight yarn to add the eye color, and I use the same technique, just going as close to the eye as I possibly can. I think it's important to use a thinner yarn when you do this, but you could experiment with like using the same type of yarn that you make the plushie with. I've never tried it. I just think it might be a little overwhelming, and you kind of want this to be like a smaller detail. Repeat the eye color and blush on the other side of the face, and then you'll have the cutest little birdie plushie ever. I think the little details do make it stand out and make it extra cute, so I think it's worth the time to sew them on. Next, I'll show you how to make this cute little pigeon. It's the same pattern, just with different color changes. I'll definitely go through it quicker and not through so much detail because I'm assuming that you just watched the Seagull one, but first I need to change the CD because the macaroni and cheese noises are starting to get to me on the Grimes one. I'm starting with a dark gray and with the same magic circle chain 1 we used to make the Seagull, and then we're going to single crochet 8 in the magic circle. Remember to skip the chain 1 we used to make the magic circle and pretend that it doesn't exist, and then we're going to increase in each stitch around. For row 3, we're going to work 1 single crochet, increase, 1 single crochet, increase, for a total of 24 stitches. This is my first time listening to this album, and what is going on? I keep messing up and having to stop to listen to what she's saying. Now we're going to single crochet for 3 rows, and you know the drill. Glub. Alright, now we're going to do a bunch of color changes, but I promise it's worth it because it's super cute. First, start off with a green and single crochet around. Then we're going to switch over to a purple, single crochet around. Then we're going to switch back to the first color, which was the color of the head. In row 9, we're going to be working 2 single crochets and then an increase, and repeating that 8 times. This will be the last increase row before we start to work on the wings. Change colors one more time, I promise, except for the feet, to a light gray for the pigeon's body. For row 10, we're going to crochet 6 single crochets before adding the wings. I'm just going to put it up on the video because I honestly don't know if I can handle saying slip stitch that many times again. Once you finish your first wing, single crochet 11, and then we can make the second one. Oh, and if you're wondering why I have a fish named Cool Guy, it's because I have a 2-year-old. I wanted to name him something cool like Dimitri or Glub or Not, but she named a Cool Guy before we even got home, so it was a done deal and I couldn't change it. So for row 11, we're going to be single crocheting around, and these are the stitches you're going to be working in underneath the wings. It should be 6 single crochets and then 4 single crochets in the back loops from row 10 underneath the wing, 11 single crochets, 4 single crochets in the back loops from row 10 under the wings, ending with 7 single crochets. And you probably already gotten a hang of the pattern and like where to put the stitches, so you probably won't have to count now that you're aware of like where the slip stitches are and where the single crochets are before and after the wings. Our birdie blob is coming together. Now let's add the eyes between rows 5 and 6 with 4 visible stitches between them. Single crochet 13, and then we'll add our bobble stitch foot. We're going to yarn over with our foot color, insert our hook, and create a 3 double crochet bobble stitch. Before we finish, we're going to drop the foot color and pick up the body color to pull through. I really like this technique, even though it does take a little bit more time and effort, because when you go to crochet the row behind the foot, it doesn't pick up any of the foot color or make it messy. It looks a lot cleaner because the stitch you're using in the next row is already the same color as the body. Single crochet 4, and then repeat the process to make the second foot. Tie off your foot color on the inside, and then we're going to single crochet 11. And remember, this is the row that's a little shorter because we basically want to put a wing on the bird's butt. It's a little tail. So repeat the same process as making the wing by slip stitching and chaining 3 to make 3 loops. And we'll use those back loops when we go around in the next row. Invisible decrease around until we reach the tail again. Work 1 single crochet in each of the 4 back loops behind the tail. Stuff your plushie before the opening begins to get smaller, and continue with a row of invisible decreases until you feel comfortable sewing the hole closed. Tie a few knots and hide your ends inside the plushie. I'll be making the beak the same way I did the seagull, only I add a little detail over the top so that it looks more like a real pigeon. Also, if you get a chance, you should totally Google what pigeon eyes look like up close. They're so detailed and like beautifully cosmic in a way. I looked at way too many pictures of birds when I was designing this pattern. And like I mentioned with the seagulls, sometimes these little details can seem like tedious and unnecessary, but I really think it brings the plushies to the next level and really makes them extra cute. Leave me a comment letting me know what type of birdies you'd like to see a tutorial on next, and thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate you. Bye!